Hi, everyone. Devin Gordon here. I'm with Andrew Forbes, the author of this wonderful book, The Only Way is the Steady Way, which features Ichiro in large part. I'm going to read the subtitle, Essays on Baseball, Ichiro, and How We Watch the Game, which, by the way, is just a lovely subtitle on top of everything else, How We Watch the Game. This is a quote from Ichiro that I want to start out by asking you with. Where did you find the Ichiro quote that is the title? Because this was a Japanese translation in a post-game press conference that I'm guessing most people did not read every word of, but you did.
Yeah, I did. First of all, thanks for doing this, Devin. It's a pleasure to get to talk about the book with you. The quote came, as you mentioned, from the post-game press conference that Ichiro gave after his final game at the Tokyo Dome in the spring of 2019 in what was officially a regular season game, even though it was played in mid-March. He gave a press conference after the game entirely in Japanese, and it was a couple of weeks later that John Thorne, the great John Thorne, the author and Major League Baseball's official historian, posted on his blog, his MLB blog, a translation that someone had done. I'm afraid I don't remember who the translator was, but the project was already underway, and I knew that it was another collection, a second collection of baseball essays, and I knew that it was almost entirely hung on the hook of Ichiro. But when I saw that particular quote, "The only way is the steady way," which was said in response to a Japanese reporter's question about basically about being a hero, and Ichiro responded, "All that I know how to do is to continue to try, continue to do the same thing, because the only way is the steady way." And as soon as I heard that, I knew that my vaguely titled Ichiro project had a title.
I can imagine it hitting you like that when you hear that phrase.
It hit me like a Louisville Slugger to the gut. It was like there's no other options from this point. It's
a beautiful phrase. I hope it sounds as beautiful in Japanese as it does in English. That was there's so many kismets along the way that make that wind up being your title, and one of them is that, like, it could sound like crap in Japanese for all we know. None of the beauty of the language that The Only Way is the Steady Way has. And it's also just such a beautiful title for what's to come in the book. I mean, it really stands for Ichiro itself, but it also stands, I think, for how you write and how you think about baseball. You're an essayist and a fiction writer based in Peterborough, Canada, which is a city that I guess is probably most famous for being the city that's not Toronto or near Toronto in the way that some American cities like Akron is sort of Cleveland. Do I have that right? Is that fair, or am I besmirching the good name of Peterborough?
I think every Canadian city suffers the curse of being not Toronto, but Peterborough is a small town. It's less than 100,000 people. It's it is increasingly a bedroom community for Toronto as Toronto expands and kind of swallows the towns around it. It's been known. It's been a bed of industry. They'll happily tell you that the first General Electric plant outside of the United States was opened here,
which I learned reading your book. Fascinating.
Yeah. So, but it's not even a second-tier Canadian city. It's a fairly small town that happens to have a university.
Gotcha.
But it's a mid-ish sized blue-collar city.
Well, so, where you're from, the way you write, the fact that the baseball team that you love is an expansion team, right? Ichiro played for an expansion team. There's a lot of outsiderness to your baseball fandom, despite the fact that, as I learned in the book, Canada has such a formative role to play in the story of baseball, and how popular it was, which I didn't realize, especially even relative to the US. And there's a similar history, right? And even more unknown history about baseball and its evolution in Japan. And so there's this sort of intersection of insider and outsider perspectives that to me seems to formulate this very specific way you think about baseball and write about baseball. And it all comes together in Ichiro. It seems like you two were kind of made for each other.
Yeah, the great appeal, as I talk about in the book, of Ichiro was that he was as different as he was, and that he did represent kind of an antithesis to what baseball looked like in the majors in America when he arrived. And certainly, being, as you say, a Canadian baseball fan does come with its own inbuilt sense of otherness, for sure. Even just being a baseball fan ahead of everything else, it is an oddity, right? You're presumed to be a hockey fan first in Canada, and baseball will do during the summer months. But where I grew up in Ottawa, especially once the Ottawa Senators fired up in the early 1990s, even during the hockey off season, the headlines are bigger for hockey than they are for baseball. So I think that you're onto something there. I think that the idea that you need to sort of assert your baseball identity in the face of doubt is something that drew me to Ichiro early on. Above and beyond all the purely aesthetic and wonderful things that he represented on the field, he felt like a way to confirm that baseball didn't have to look a certain way, or baseball fandom didn't have to look a certain way.
Yeah, I mean, there's a chapter about Rob Dibble, the infamous Rob Dibble, the Nasty Boys, right, of the Cincinnati Reds, the fireballing, a very, very familiar character in baseball, an archetypal character, not just him specifically, but that kind of persona is very representative of baseball, American baseball. And you use that great Philip Roth phrase, American berserk, to describe that kind of era of baseball. And the one that I think we're only sort of getting out of in our own way. We've sort of scienced it up now a little bit, but we're only sort of now emerging from it. But I want to quote you here because I thought this was a great language. You wrote, you described it as America's gobbling ambition, its voraciousness, the muscly sense that to grind a ball into dust is a better and more exclamatory statement than a run scored piecemeal through guile, sacrifice, and great hits and base hits. And as I hear that and I think of Rob Dibble and his objections and the objections that people had to Ichiro, what I keep hearing is the word sneaky, that they thought of him as sneaky, which of course has its own very specific racial coding to it. But the irony of claiming that, which is actually just baseball skill and strategy, the game of baseball, as sneaky, was just sort of a fascinating revelation on what American baseball meant and what he was really challenging, right?
Right. And it's a short-sighted view as well, right? Because it fails to take into account that, baseball prior to Babe Ruth essentially was the very game that Ichiro was playing, right?
Yeah.
And that's what, it's funny, for a game that prides itself on being as aware as any or more sport of its own past, baseball does sometimes have a very selective memory. And in the case of the objections to Ichiro, or the doubts that he faced during that first spring training in the spring of 2001, they hinged on him not playing a game that they discussed as though it were the only way baseball had ever been played, when in fact that just wasn't true.
Yeah, and what they were describing was really American. They were saying it wasn't American. They weren't saying it wasn't baseball. And what I thought was interesting in retrospect, rereading that, reading that chapter and revisiting that moment of Rob Dibble and those characters, it's almost like you can hear some of the insecurity underneath, right? That we know how puffed up all that was. We've seen all the Will Ferrell lampoons of those characters in the decades since.
Right. Yeah.
And reading Rob Dibble discuss Ichiro now, all I think is, wow, he knows he couldn't have gotten that guy out.
Yeah, right. And that's it, exactly. So in sort of holding up the, we can call it the three true outcomes, or the the Earl Weaver get on base and hit a 3-run
Yeah.
home run. Baseball. What they were admitting tacitly was, you're right, that they knew they couldn't compete in the game that he was playing.
Yeah, and immediately you have this great description of how immediately impactful he was. Not just because he was so good, but in part because of how wonderfully it exploited the brawniness of this American game. You describe it as a style of play that exploited contemporary baseball's ample seams and pores, which just, even in the language, has this sort of just macho physicality that you just picture this, just gifted athlete who's playing the game at a much higher level, just running circles around, which you can imagine how infuriating that must have been for Rob Dibble, right?
And of course, Ichiro wasn't the first Japanese player, right? But the same knocks that they had against pitchers like Hideo Nomo, which was that he could not overpower you with a 95-mile-per-hour fastball. He had to trick you, which is the same veiled attack, right? It's the same idea that, well, there's no way you're ever going to beat us in strength because of who you are, but so you have to resort to these underhanded tactics to get us out or to beat us. And I think it was infuriating for a lot of people. And I think that even, I think we all acknowledge that Pete Rose is kind of a caricature even of himself. But his objections when Ichiro was approaching Rose's hit total, Ichiro's combined NPB and Major League total was approaching Rose's. The vehemence with which Rose said that they weren't the same thing was very much, it really did sound like a man who felt that his relevance was threatened. And I think that he, in that way, was emblematic of kind of old school baseball in general, just worrying that opening up, once the players come, once Nomo is a rookie of the year, and then 6 years later, Ichiro comes over and does the incredible things that he does, you can't pretend that part of the world doesn't exist anymore. You cannot ignore global baseball. And that means that there may be other ways to do this thing that we've been doing the same way for decades. And that's an existential threat to those guys.
The particular transparency of Pete Rose's xenophobia is really fascinating there, right?
Yeah.
Because it's almost like he ends up being like a control in the experiment, because if there's any player who was very Ichiro-ish in the way that he got on base and played, and obviously their personalities have zero in common, but this was a guy who slapped the baseball around and just seemed to be a wizard for finding holes and putting his bat on the ball. So for him to have that level of an objection to Ichiro, what else could it be but xenophobia? There's nothing left.
That's
right?
it.
Yeah, I mean, it's and you really have a great way of putting this in the book. I'm sorry to keep quoting you, but as a writer, you probably like that, right? I mean, you say beneath all of them lies the bedrock objection. It's not the American game, which is absolutely correct. It's the Japanese game adapted from the American game as it was introduced to Tokyo in about 1872. And I love the way that line flips it around, because we expect the argument to be made that, hey, it's all baseball. It's all baseball. Stop pretending this is all baseball. And you're actually going the other way, and you're saying, no. Yeah, they play a very different game. They developed a very different game. That's why it's different. It's a different way to play this same game. That doesn't mean it's not baseball. And I think it's, here again, coming back to this outsiderness, maybe it takes a Canadian to see the sort of solipsism of that American viewpoint there.
Well, that's our great pastime, of course, is pointing out American solipsism and feasting on your mistakes. That might be the case. It's hard to know. I mean, I won't pretend to speak for all Canadian baseball fans. I don't know that they see the game the same way that I do. But it just, it came from that idea that, 1998 was a strange time. right? I think even those of us who love home runs agreed that the summer of 1998 was a strange time, where we were all kind of looking around at each other like, yeah, but it's not right,
Real,
right?
right?
Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and it felt like, as a baseball fan, it felt good because you knew that baseball needed this in terms of attention and box office after 94. And we especially felt that up here because of what the 94 strike did to the Expos.
Yeah.
But certainly even before Ichiro debuted, it had begun to feel ridiculous to me, the way that the game had amped up. And there were a lot of factors, of course, and performance enhancing drugs were one of them, and new ballparks with particular dimensions were another. But he was a bit of water in the desert for me as a fan, because he showed that you didn't need to be a 40 home run guy to have an enormous impact on the game.
One of my favorite chapters in the book is when you draw this comparison, connecting John Prine, the late great John Prine. So I think I think it was the first person we lost to COVID that like really doubled me over. Maybe there was someone before that. I mean, missing the timing, but that was the first.
He was pretty early though. He was like April. It was pretty early when Prine died. Yeah.
And it was also sort of like one of those moments when we realized that it was going to be particularly hard on musicians.
Yeah.
Right? For all reasons, but the comparison that you draw between him and between Ichiro was just fascinating. And I'm going to read it again. Sorry, folks, if you're listening, but this is good for the book. Both baseball and roots music are presumed to possess an essential conservatism. Baseball's vaunted pastorality is chained to its fear of change, its reluctance to follow other organizations like the NBA in championing social causes, and the overwhelming whiteness of its boardrooms, clubhouses, and fan base. Likewise, you don't need me to tell you that country music isn't generally considered the most progressive or diverse of musical genres. Ichiro and Prine ran counter to the apparent folksiness of their respective milieus. I'm going to get out of the way and let you talk about that for a little bit, because that's a fascinating parallel to draw, and right on point, I think, because Ichiro has a conservatism of his own kind that is very, very small c conservatism, I guess, of his own kind, that runs very, very, very counter to the large C progressivism that we tend to associate with that kind of a personality in a lot of the same ways that Prine does in his music. So just tell me about that thought, where it came from. And
that thought, and that whole essay was a very late inclusion, because my editor rightly pointed out that we needed something to kind of bridge the years that I hadn't really gone into detail about Ichiro's. But the thought was one that had been in the back of my head for years. We used to live, I live now in a not large city, but we used to live in the country. And I had enjoyed for decades, I've enjoyed, country music and alternative country music and roots music and everything. And to a lot of people, that signals a certain political mindset. But, most of my favorite artists were not Trumpists, right? Or supporters of
most great country artists would not have been Trumpists, right? Yeah.
Well, that's true, exactly. Yeah. But I really enjoyed there being, it's like one of my favorite things about traveling in the States is finding those little blue pockets in red states, and that's that was kind of the space I'd carved out for myself in listening to country music and roots music. And Ichiro, it seemed to me, and fairly early on, a good parallel in that he was, I think it's safe to say that there's I think you have factions in a baseball clubhouse, right? And Ichiro would not have been a natural part of any of them. And I enjoyed that. I really liked that about him. I'm sure it might have made his life more difficult in a lot of ways, and it continues to make life difficult for a lot of Asian-born players in American baseball. But I liked the edge it gave to his game, and seemed to me parallel or similar to the edge that Prine's politics gave his music.
Tell me more about that. How did it?
Well, I
How
think
did
that
that
there's,
manifest itself?
like you either hide who you are or you steer into it, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And so there's no mistaking. Prime would play the same stages and the same award shows as some, real hardcore conservative country music artists, but he wouldn't shy away from the fact that he was who he was.
right.
He would play songs with this beautiful, progressive, liberal, humanist, and later more religious later in his career, but these ideas that I don't have to vote the same way that you do for you to accept me.
Mm-hmm.
And Ichiro, I think, won over the respect of everybody who played on the same diamond as he did in time, because there was no denying the quality and the dedication of his game. And so, a Rob Dibble eventually has to admit that Ichiro is a once in a lifetime player. He's a a surefire Hall of Famer, and his impact on the game could not be overstated.
He's also really fun to watch. I think that was the, like on a fundamental level, I think that that's what overpowered Rob Dibble and the Rob Dibbles in the end was he was just fun. It was really fun to watch him play.
But if he'd only been fun to watch and hadn't put up the numbers to support it, it would have been easy to laugh him off the field.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, the aesthetic joy I still get. Even that clip, I don't know if you saw it a couple days ago, the Mariners posted on social media clips of Ichiro in a simulated game. So he was playing right field and Mike Cameron was playing center field. and he went up to bat. There was video of Ichiro up to bat, and he's just so enjoyable to watch. There's just something about the way that he moves. It's just incredibly enjoyable for me.
I'm a big basketball fan, ironically, for someone who's written a book about baseball. If you can see behind me, there's a giant poster of like the history of basketball uniforms. And
Yep.
You and I are sort of, I think, constitutionally attracted to players who are kind of like glitches in the matrix a little bit. And which is one of the reasons why in basketball, I've always been on a James Harden island. He's a very, very divisive, let's say, NBA player. And I sort of understand, sort of all the sort of foul drawing I understand the reasons why people don't enjoy his style of play, the aesthetics of it. Like I understand the aesthetic objection to it, but on sort of the mere spiritual level, I think I identify with him and enjoy him for similar reasons that you seem to like Ichiro, which is just that he's like, oh, you're going to go this way? I'm going to go this way. You know what I mean? It's just, and it's not like it's a strategic decision so much as it's like, it's just who I am to go this way, right? I know it's your way to go this way. I go this way. And I'm the only one who does this. And it's something that I love about James Harden, I love about Ichiro, and I love about athletes in general who are like that. And I'm wondering if that's similar for you. Are there other Ichiros in your sort of bag?
I saddled myself because for decades I've been a Knicks fan, so there hasn't been a lot to cheer for there.
Yeah.
But I was
first of all, wait, hold on a second. What did you do that for?
I did that because I did that probably out of a sense of contrarianism, but also because I was really enthralled as a kid from the jump with Patrick Ewing.
Oh, okay.
And my dad tried to draw me into this dichotomy where he had a script written where he was a Larry Bird Celtics fan, and he kind of drafted me into becoming a Magic Johnson Lakers fan, but I didn't really want that. Seemed too black and white to me. Pardon the pun, but it seemed too like
yeah. He wanted you to be a Lakers fan.
He thought it'd be fun if we had like a back and forth like that, because this was the height of the rivalry.
Interesting.
But I was just more excited. At that age, and so Ewing was drafted in 84, is that right? So I was like 8 years old.
Yeah.
But I'm sure I just saw him in one of Dad's copies of Sports Illustrated and decided he was my guy, and then probably saw some videos somewhere. So when the Knicks took him, yeah, they became, and this was and around here, if you're not a Raptors fan, you're an alien. And my kids, I hope, will become Raptors fans, because I don't want them to inherit the pain of the sort of Dolan stupidity that I lived through. But anyway, that aside, so there hasn't been, I mean, I enjoyed Carmelo's not style of game necessarily, but the results. But I was very excited when Curry came into his own, because he had an instantaneous and noticeable effect when he started just chucking up threes from the logo. It was like you're describing, like everyone was like, wait, you can do that? Like that's a thing that you can do?
Yeah.
And I always, when I'm watching basketball now with my kids, I always try to impress upon them the difference in how the game is played. Like, and I try to imagine like what would happen if some third string guard on like a Chuck Daly team started trying to rein in threes from well beyond the arc, right? And the chewing out that guy would have gotten, and how it would have affected his minutes, right? Whereas now, the positional revolution, or the anti-positional revolution and everything, but that is remarkable. But Steph Curry was for several years for me, before it became the norm, fun to watch for, I think, similar reasons. And before that, there's probably some patriotism involved here, but Steve Nash, and the whole, the
7 seconds or less, sure.
Yeah, 7 seconds or less. Those Suns teams, when they were basically, rewriting the playbook, and that was really interesting to me.
I mean, well,
it wasn't, but I will say it wasn't necessary. I wasn't necessarily drawn to it. It was an interesting intellectual exercise, but I considered, like, Knicks, Heat playoff games from the 90s that were basically prison yard fights to be the norm. I think that's what the NBA looks like. What is it that they're doing? How is this still all within the rules? Can this be the same game?
I want to get back to Steph and Steve Nash, because those are, well, no, let's just go with those examples, because they're such interesting examples, because of course you just brought up two guys who, like Ichiro, there was a lot of controversy about them. There was a lot of old school belief that their style of play was bullshit, was a corruption of the game. And what's interesting, as I sort of think about it, is that all of these people that we're talking about, especially even if you throw Mike D'Antoni into that mix, who learned how to play basketball, or how to innovate in basketball in the Italian league, right? All of these guys are outsiders, right? Steve Nash is a Canadian, right? Mike D'Antoni is, a West Virginian who learned how to think about basketball in Italy. Steph Curry, I don't even want to get into the ways in which he is considered an outsider in a social and political perspective in the NBA. There's a lot of issues there, but even just the way that he plays basketball makes him an outsider. He was overlooked, right? I went to Duke University, so I knew all about it. Yeah, sorry about that. I always have to apologize for that. I'm a Mets fan. It's like I balance it out. But like because I went to Duke and we played Davidson every year, I saw Steph Curry 4 times in college. 4. And so when he was in the draft, I was like, what are you people doing? This guy is ridiculous. This guy's going to score from everywhere. He's going to run circles around people. And it was too thin, too small, whatever. And we could see it with our own eyes, and because of that, you were just like, there was no can't miss to it. But all of those people that you're describing have both a on the court radicalism, that the distrust for it, I think, is multiplied by whatever physical, personal, biographical thing they bring to it that makes people go, I don't trust you with this. I don't trust you with this, right? And usually that's where those, and it feels like you're, like I was, as a Mets fan, a lifelong Mets fan, I loved Pedro Martinez even when he was on the Expos. Like, it was
yeah.
weird. Like, I love Pedro Martinez so much that I didn't even care when he was dicing us up. That's how much I loved him.
Yeah.
And I felt like he was another character like that who just a glitch in the matrix.
Yeah.
I assume you liked Pedro.
I loved Pedro, yeah, and was sad to see him leave the Expos for sure. Because we did, when there wasn't a Blue Jays game on here, there was an Expos game on. Yeah, there's something to what you're saying. Absolutely, these people are not prototypical physical specimens for the roles that they end up filling, and they do something, either coincidentally or as a result of that, they do something to the game, which causes double takes and inspires an awful lot of doubt and in some cases derision. So there may be an element of iconoclasm to my fandom that I hadn't really considered in a holistic fashion until you brought it up just now. But and I like.
While I'm giving you credit, let me give you a little bit more credit, okay? Because here's the thing: sometimes there are people who are attracted to those kind of iconoclasts just because they kind of like the iconoclasts, and a lot of those iconoclasts come and go because they are stunts. They get figured out very, very quickly.
Sure.
And maybe you have a fetish for those folks as well too. I like them. I tend to like them too. The wildcats of whatever. But Ichiro, Steph, Nash, we're talking about people who really did transform their sports, like really did change it. And so what you're sort of putting your finger on, I think, is kind of a outsider visionary type phenomenon. A little bit.
Yeah, I think
in something early.
I think that it's healthy for any form, and I'm speaking not just of sports here, but art forms or systems to be shaken up. I don't want to sound like somebody who's like pro disruption in the Silicon Valley sense.
Yeah.
But when you take something which is kind of begun to rust in place, and you knock the rust off the wheels by saying we can come at this a different way, when it's successful and that it's so persuasive that it ends up changing the way the game is played. Like we're talking about with people raining in threes from any spot on the court. That's exciting. That's really exciting, and it tends to reinvigorate whatever the form is, right? And I've loved baseball my whole life, but I think one of the lies about that surrounds baseball is this idea that it's best when it's static. It's never been static. It's the continuity that makes it the most interesting, right? But within continuity, you can have change, you can have revolution, and that's what Ichiro brought. To be clear, though, he did not completely transform the game. We're still, as you said earlier, we're still talking about a game which is primarily concerned with scoring runs in bunches.
Yeah.
It's just that now we've couched it in scientific language and principles of physics. But he did prove at a very high level that you can be successful without adhering to that model.
And I think we see it now too, right? When he was doing it, there was this resistance to it. Not from everyone. There were a lot of people. I loved him. I was very excited. It just seemed cool. And there were a lot of people who were really excited about Ichiro. The resistance to it, I think we've all gotten to that place now that this sort of dong ball universe kind of sucks, right? I think we're all, even the guys who hit home runs for a living are kind of like, this is getting a little boring, quite honestly.
Yeah.
And I think that the contrast, what Ichiro taught us about skill and the beauty of it, that you can be really effective playing the game this way. It's just really, really hard to do. Is something that maybe we've slowly but surely started to absorb, and I feel like we're longing for a little bit as baseball fans. You see some of the rule changes, right, are all marching toward getting the ball in play, right? Let's get more action on the base path. Let's get more Ichiro into the game, right? And we all feel like we want that now, right? Right.
Well, because that's the secret. The secret isn't that people are tuning out. It is, like I say in the book, it's a matter of superabundance, right? It's too much sugar. I enjoy a home run. If my team is down two, and there's a 3-run home run is very exciting. But when it comes at the expense of everything else, it's like I have friends who teach creative writing, and they always tell me things like the students that I have now don't read, and it similarly, a lot of the players that are coming up now are doing so without the same foundation of fundamentals that players that we watched when we were younger would not have been allowed on the field without, sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what needs to be. Ichiro is a good icon, a good star to point yourself toward. There are very important parts of the game that don't involve throwing 99 or hitting at the correct launch angle to make a ball clear the fence. So
it's also like, I feel like the tone of that conversation has graduated from sounding like a cranky purist when we say things like that, to being like, no, you can win playing this way. You're doing it wrong. This is not smart. And that's a very different conversation than sort of crossing your arms and being like, well, back in my day. It's a very different thing, right?
And the secondary goal, right, which is, or probably the primary goal, which is if baseball is really concerned, and baseball being the commissioner's office is really concerned that people are tuning out, the answer is not shaving 7 minutes off the average length of the game. The answer is giving more dramatic games, right? The games where the outcome is more in doubt.
I'll watch the shit out of a 4-hour game if it's exciting. Like it's the game that they're putting on the field that it feels like they're and it feels like I said, like it feels like they're starting to understand. We're having less of a conversation about the length of games and more conversation about pace. Right. And that feels like a really healthy evolution to be, making sure we're just having more fun when we're watching. I mean, I say this as someone, because I just finished an entire book about the Mets. And one thing that I noticed as I was going through it was how little Mets history is built around home runs in either direction. The Mets don't really have a lot of monumental home runs in their history. In fact, I think that the two biggest home runs of this century for the Mets did not happen in regular season games and were kind of fundamentally meaningless. We haven't suffered from dramatic, we've lost in a million ways, but weirdly not from massive back-breaking home runs. That's very rarely happened to the Mets. And we have a delightful, rich, thrilling history of baseball with very few of it built around home runs. And I think that that's probably unusual, but I think it also does say something interesting about what could actually be the most colorful version of the sport, right?
That's true. Now, the Mariners are similar in before and since, in that the home run is not featured.
Yeah, I picture Ken Griffey sliding. I can't think of a home run.
Right. It's doubles and big catches and the home run does not feature all that prominently in the history of either of those organizations. Whereas my A team, my primary team,
Toronto, a little different.
a little bit different, but I mean, when I wrote that and it went into the book, I kind of prepared to duck and cover a little bit, right? There's going to be some blowback, I figure, because it's I don't want to come out and say that I hate home runs, because I don't, but I want a game where the home run is less vital to the proceedings, and that's, I hope, where we're headed. I guess we'll see. We'll see what effect this new ball has on the game this season.
Yeah. I mean, I'm excited about that stuff. I feel like, I know what you mean when you sort of come out against home runs or seem like you're coming out against home runs. It's like, it's almost seemed like you're arguing for, the way people used to say, gosh, I just loved a 1-0 pitcher's duel. And so did I, the once a month that happened, you know what I mean? It was great, but what you're really arguing for is not the 1-0. I would love an 8-6 game with just 7 doubles, some stolen bases, someone taking, like that I really, really miss. And that feels like the, in many ways, an Ichiro style of play. Because we're talking about Ichiro, quiet, steady. There's one glitch in the matrix Ichiro moment that didn't come up in the book, and maybe you've written about, but I wanted to get your opinion on, which is, of course, the infamous berserker rant that Ichiro would do in the AllStar clubhouse before every game. Have you written about that? What's your feelings of what are there recordings of this? I don't believe that. Is it?
I think that one of the ground rules is that there aren't recordings.
There aren't, right? That's the rule, right?
I don't think it's only word of mouth. It's just something that's kind of handed down, in whispers. So this is the infamous, whenever he made the All-Star, the 10 times he made the AllStar game, Ichiro would, and it was everyone who didn't know better, it was their understanding that Ichiro's English was not very good. But in fact, Ichiro spoke very good English. He just preferred to use an interpreter so that he wouldn't be misunderstood. His Spanish was decent too, but so he would give a pregame pep talk to the American League All-Stars, primarily I think for the benefit of the rookies or the guys who'd never been on the All-Star team before, which was just full of, in English, standing on a chair, which was just full of expletives. And it is a wonderful story, just like the joke he told Bob Costas way back in whatever it was about the Heat in Kansas City. Yeah, I don't know that I've ever written about it, and I didn't know where to put it in this book. It might have been something I'm keeping in my pocket for another one. I don't know, but it is a wonderful story, and it speaks to something again, which kind of nicely undercuts a public image, right? Ichiro is supposed to be this very straight-laced and tight and conservative and self-contained figure, but he is more than willing to let loose under the right circumstances.
It just the little glimpse that it shows you of what's underneath.
Yeah, and what I wouldn't give to be a fly on the wall of that clubhouse to hear it for once. But,
I'm really torn between loving the fact that we'll never see it or hear it, and praying someday, somehow, we'll at least hear it, even if we don't see it. Because I'm not sure I believe that it doesn't exist. You know what I mean? Do you believe that there's no? By the eighth or ninth time he's doing this, I'm just sure there's someone's recording, be like, look, we got to get this. There's just I'm bugging the room. I don't care. Don't you think?
Yeah, I think it may well come out someday, but it also might be that a relationship. By the end, he may have cultivated a relationship with his peers and with the writers that was similar to like a mantle with the New York press, right? Where they know the secrets, but they're playing along. They don't want to go against him and let it out. Who knows? Maybe it'll surface, or maybe maybe it won't. You're right. I don't know which one I like better. Which scenario is preferable?
Well, let's end on one thing I learned about from reading your book, which is spring koshien. Am I pronouncing it right?
I think so, yeah.
Because it's March.
Yes.
Do you know anything about what's happening with it right now? Is it happening right now?
It is. They are running it this year, with reduced capacity at the stadium.
Right. Can you just tell what you should tell, since I'm talking about it like everyone knows what it is? Why don't you tell everyone what it is?
The Koshien is the huge high school baseball tournament that they play twice a year. In fact, they play what's known as the spring Koshien in March, and then the big one is the summer Koshien, which I believe caps the seasons. Right, you've got to play in regionally from each prefecture. In Japan, there's a regional winner, and they all go to this giant tournament. And the stadium itself was built in the 20s. Koshien Stadium seats something like 50,000. I think originally it seated closer to 60. It's full of people, and the society kind of grounds to a halt. It is, it's compared to March Madness in terms of the attention that it garners, but I think it's even bigger than that.
Mm-hmm.
The spring is because it doesn't come at the end of a grueling season, and there isn't as much drama preceding it, is not as big a tournament as the summer one, but it is still impressive. And there's a fantastic documentary by Emma Ryan Yamazaki, who's a Japanese filmmaker, called Koshien, which focuses on a team making its way toward the summer Koshien, and the drama is, the tension is, considerable. But one of the famous things about it is that each player at the conclusion of the tournament, whether they've won or they've been eliminated early, is to take some of the dirt from the infield, because Cushing Stadium features an all dirt infield. There's no cutouts. And bring that home with them. And most of those players treasure that sort of for the rest of their lives. And I love that image. I invoke it in the book of this small keepsake that is a connection to sort of a glorious and terrifying time in a young ball player's life. And Ichiro played at the Koshien. He didn't distinguish himself terrifically, but his team did go. And most of the famous players that we know of on this side of the Pacific Ocean have played in the Koshien. And it's just an incredible spectacle if you ever have a chance to watch it. I've never gone in person. I hope that's sort of on my bucket list, but even just catching a video feed, if you are able through whatever means to do so, it's definitely worth watching.
Yeah, by reading about that, I added that to my little baseball bucket list, which includes the Midnight Sun game in Alaska, which didn't happen.
Yeah, I would like to do that as well. Yeah.
Didn't happen last summer for the first time in about a century, but we'll be back on this summer. The book, The Only Way is the Steady Way. I also meant to ask you about this beautiful cover. Tell me, we discussed this beforehand, but tell me again about the cover.
My publisher is called Invisible Publishing, and they have an in-house designer named Megan Fields, who, she is fantastic, and she takes a lot of input from the author, and comes up with some scenarios, and collectively we settle on one that we think is the best, and she perfects it. And this one is just, we were talking earlier. So my earlier baseball book is called The Utility of Boredom, and that's the cover she came up with for that, which I've heard anecdotally many, many times. The cover alone sold that book. So, and the new one, as far as I'm concerned, this is the fourth cover she's designed for one of my books, and this one, they get better with each iteration.
I mean, I just got to hold it up again, just because, I'm a big designer, and that exact pose of Ichiro, is that is so Ichiro. I could close my eyes and picture either sort of his bats with like his legs crossing and the bat sort of swinging in front of him. I could picture the swing, and I can picture that gesture of him pulling the jersey right there. That's just,
yeah, she nailed it. She really did. And the biggest part of my input for this one was that I wanted the color teal featured, because I thought we'd already leaned a little heavily on the green for the earlier book.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that shade of teal. It just kind of exemplifies the kind of, the late Rodriguez years and the late, the mid Griffey years, and when Ichiro came over. I love that shade of teal, those jerseys. So I wanted that on there. And she focused on going through the book, the descriptions I have of him calling the whole world into stillness for that split second when he goes into that part of his stance, tugging on the sleeve of his jersey, holding the bat erect like that, and just slowing everything down. So yeah, she nailed it. It's fantastic.
Well, it was great talking with you. Good luck with the book. Tell us the release date again.